everybody. This is Jess from 3D Learning Experts, and you're listening to the LD Experts Podcast, the show for busy parents who want to help their kids with learning disabilities, or as I like to say, learning differences, go from surviving to thriving. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today, we are going to be learning about IEPs from April Rehrig. And Rise, she's with Rise Educational Advocacy. Welcome, April.
Thank you so much, Jess, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on today and share with our audience about IEPs and how you are helping people get through the IEP process.
Yes.
So tell us, how did you get started working with IEPs?
Oh, that's sort of a long and a short-winded question, Jess. Before I am what I am now, which is an IEP trainer, I think that's how I identify myself. I started many, many years ago. I started volunteering in special education schools when I was a teenager, and I fell in love. And I said, this is what I love. This is what I want to do. I came from a family of educators, so it was only natural for me to go into the same field. And so I decided to become a teacher. And my first year teaching, or second year, teaching, I taught second grade. And I had a student in my class. I'll call him Juan because I've changed his name. And Juan kind of got me started down the land of school psychology. I thought because Juan was struggling and he wasn't getting good grades, I thought, I know exactly what's going on. He has a learning disability. He has to have, an IEP. It's exactly what's going on. So I referred him for testing. We came to the IEP, and the school psychologist set me down. She said, April, Juan is gifted. He does not need an IEP. You need to change how you teach. And I thought, okay, wow, I was way off base. I thought because a child was failing, it's because of them. And I realized actually it's the way that you teach really influences the children, and every child is different. And so I had to check my expectations at the door as a new teacher. So that turned me on to school psychology, and I became a school psychologist for about 20 years. And I worked in different schools. I'm in the LA area, so I worked in high profile districts. I worked in Compton and Watts. I worked all over town, different districts. And I loved what I did, and peppered in between then, I went back to teaching. I taught a kindergarten blended class. And then right before the pandemic, which I didn't expect to do, I left school psychology, and my boss told me, April, what are you going to do? Because I kind of knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't really have the words, and they just came out. I was like, I want to be an advocate. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's just going to rail me, right? She's a special ed coordinator. And she said, you know what, April, you would be great. So I came into advocacy. I went to a bunch of different classes in schools. I went to COPA, and I got all these certifications. And I knew I wanted to be an advocate, but I also knew I wanted to blend teaching and school psychology. And I felt like this was a field that just needed so much support. And so when I developed Rise, what I've done is created an online platform so that everyone at the table can get IEP training. You're not going to have to hire an advocate who doesn't know your child to come to the meeting. You're not going to have to sit there and spend months or years on listservs or go to Facebook groups where you get ill advice. You can go to one place where you as a mom, you as a teacher, you as a school psych can get the training you need, so you feel like you can have more productive IEPs. And that's the name of the game, is that so many of these meetings I sat in for years and years, everyone is confused. People are frustrated. Mom's having a meltdown. The school psych is like, why didn't you even look at my report? The teacher and the student are sitting in the meeting and they're like, what? This isn't what we talked about. And it's just this whole kind of jumbled mess of legalese and confusing paperwork. And it's not really focusing on the child and what the child needs. And so my trainings help everybody to know the process. They walk you through the steps, and they also empower teams to work with strength-based IEPs and create educational plans that actually make sense.
That's awesome. I wish that was available back when my kids were young. So how does your program work? Does it take a long time? Is it really complicated to learn?
Those are great questions, Jess. So each one of my trainings right now, I have two, but I have more. They take you through the process. And again, it's done online or virtually on demand. And each course is less than 24 hours to complete. And the way that I teach is the way that I taught kindergarten, because that's where I learned my best teaching skills, is that they're visually based, right? Short-term videos, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You can be folding laundry, you can be doing whatever. And then through each video, I also have fillable templates, worksheets, letters, how to request testing, like professionally written letters. And all of this sort of supplements the small videos. So you get through each section and then you're like, okay, I got a video. I understand. Okay, I'm hearing this. Okay, here's this script that April told me about. Okay, here's a worksheet. So I know exactly what I need to write in my letter. So it makes it really usable friendly. And then when you go back to the site, you can go back as many times as you want. So, your child is an IEP next year, you can go back and redo the first course. If you feel like you need another area, you can go back. And it's not like you get one paper and then you're like, wait, what happened last year? So right now, my two courses that I have available, my most popular one is how to request testing, because that's what we all talk about. And it walks you through the entire process, from how to say, I need help, how to have great pre-meetings, how to request drafts before the IEP, how to request an amazing assessment with a great letter, how to work with assessors to get joint assessment plans, and ultimately how to get to IEP land. But the other thing the course does is it walks you through if you need a triennial, if you need a supplemental eval, you need a speech, OT, any kind of assessment, you can use the same methodology. So that's my first course. And my second course is understanding reports. And that takes you into the whole school psych world of like, what do scores mean? What are the most important parts of a report? How do I connect with the IEP? And then ultimately, how to get a great report without having to get an IEE, without having to get a private eval, how you can actually have great meetings with the assessors and get all the stuff you need, and there's no drama.
And so you mentioned at first that it's 24 hours for each or less for each course.
Correct.
But the videos are 5 to 10 minutes. So the 24 hours, does that include also writing the letters for this to the schools?
Yeah, so included in the 24 hours, there's like my first course, how to request testing. I think there's 11 videos on there and then like 14 worksheets. So it sort of takes you through each little module. So you have like a first lesson the first lesson is about special ed process. And then the second one is how to ask for help. And then the third one is how do you sit down with the school before? So it goes through each different section and then has the worksheets to go along with it. And what's nice is that you can book it all out if you want to and do everything in less than 24 hours, Jess. But if you want to take a week or two and do one day for this and then do a little bit of homework there and then go back on Tuesday and do the next lesson, it's at your own pace. And that's what I appreciate, at least when I was a teacher. It's like some people are fast learners, other people need the visual and the audio, and then other people just need to hear it over and over again. Because special education, it is complicated. It just doesn't have to be once you really understand how everything works.
Well, and I love that because I'm the kind of learner or the kind of doer, not necessarily just a learner, but the kind of person where I like to focus on one project at a time. And then there's the kind of people who like to do 15 minutes a day of a project. So it sounds like the way you have created it is it can go either way for whatever type of personality someone has.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we all learn differently. And like I go back to my experience with Juan, is that he was failing and it wasn't because he had a learning disability. And he might have had one in retrospect because he definitely wasn't succeeding, but I wasn't adjusting the way I was teaching. And so that's the bottom line, is like, we need to think about how can we reform special education. And if we're going to fix the IEPs in a traditional advocacy world, we just work on, getting things correct. But that's not going to reform the process. If we want to reform the process, everyone needs training. When I was a school psychologist and a teacher, I'll tell you, we didn't get any training on IEP development. We got nothing. We got training on how to write a legally compliant assessment report. We got training on what not to put on the IEP. We never got training how to connect our reports to the IEP. And we definitely never got training on how to write a strength-based IEP. That was like, what? Like, what are strengths? Like, how do we use that? So that's kind of, where we need to go, because special education is still in the dark ages and we focus on the deficits instead of capitalizing on strengths, talking about the amazing things that our kids can do, and crafting plans that are really future forward and outcome based instead of April will not do this or April will not do that. That doesn't do anything.
And is it practical for parents to be able to expect the school to adjust the teaching for their child?
It is practical. And the thing is that if you work with the team in terms of having a collaborative approach, for example, like the teaching methodology, it makes it so much more easier at the IEP meeting. So a lot of times, like when I was a school psychologist, parents would say, well, can't you just add this accommodation? And because they couched it and phrased that way, the teacher's like, oh, no, I can't do this. I can't do that. But if they phrased it a different way, well, okay, so my child has dyslexia and she's really struggling with phonemic awareness. What do you think, teacher? What would help you so that April could do better? All of a sudden, the teacher was like, oh, well, I could do this and I could do that. And it made it so much easier. And then the parents got the accommodations that they wanted because they knew how to ask for it. And then the teacher didn't feel threatened. So she was like, oh, that's amazing. I'll totally do that.
Oh, wow. Wording really makes a huge difference on getting things you want in life.
And the language too, Jess, that's along with the strength-based, plans. I read so many psych reports over the years, and this, probably happened to you as a parent. It's like you read these psych reports or any report for that matter, and you're crying because you're like, this is not my child. Like, who is this? This is just talking about all the terrible things and they're not capable and they can't do this and they can't do that. When that's predisposing teachers and everybody else to have zero expectations. And you can write the same psych report and have high expectations, but talk about all the things that a child can do and then focus on what are we going to do differently. And that's the ultimate goal of special education, is having the child thrive and do well by expecting a lot and presuming competence, but also challenging them, through an IEP that makes sense. And that's what we're lacking in special education. And that's kind of the next step to get better IEPs, is really changing that language.
Well, when my daughter had her first, we lived in Texas, so it was an ARD instead of an IEP. And so when we got her first psych eval back, it said that she had a 90 IQ. And I, at that time, didn't understand what the different IQ scores were. However, my mother was a retired teacher, and she was like, there is no way that her IQ was only 90. However, now I understand that's because she could not read and respond to all the questions that were placed in front of her. So that lowered her results for her IQ.
Yeah, that's so true. I did a podcast a couple years ago, and that's all we talked about, is that, there's more than meets the eye than standardized test scores, and you have to look at functional academics, and then ultimately you have to cross-validate things. So if you see something on the WISC, so what? What does that mean? Nothing. It just means that's how you did on the test. That has nothing to do with your actual performance. And all of us who've been in a classroom and been through school, we know that grit, work habits, study habits, executive functioning, that's really what we're talking about. That's real life skills. A WISC score has nothing to do with it. But so many school psychologists and other clinicians were like, oh, well, they got the standard score, so yeah, they don't qualify. Instead of that whole child approach, which is exactly what I'm talking about, is when you look beyond the standardized test scores and you use this, cross-validated with that, and then you use the parent input, right? Where mom's like, she can't get her homework done. She can't get her homework done. there's a reason for that. And so you kind of look at all these different avenues. And then when you craft the IEP, you have a better, well-rounded explanation for what the child needs. And then ultimately the goals and the services, all of that follows through because you did a better job in the testing in the first place, instead of I do my test scores, here's what it is, and that's the IEP, that's it.
So that makes me think about my second youngest child who did not qualify for an IEP, who has profound dysgraphia. However, for the testing that was done, he only had to write a paragraph. Well, he was like 14 years old and could easily write a paragraph. The problem was he couldn't write an entire 5-page paper, which is what is expected of a 14-year-old. So he didn't qualify. And so then I had to educate the charter school we were with on a 504, and I had to get him a 504 so that we could have accommodations for the CHESP test, which is the California High School Exit exam. What do you recommend for students who run into that kind of situation where the parent knows that they have major struggles, however there's not enough of a discrepancy to qualify for an IEP?
That's where the how to request testing course comes into play, because I teach the parents how to craft an assessment letter, request letter. It's not just saying you want your child tested. You are talking about the areas of need. So you are saying, okay, school psych, I'm suspecting my child has deficits with executive functioning. I'm, assuming my child has deficits with auditory processing. And then throughout the assessment process, you are writing what's called a parent report. You're writing what's called a parent letter of attachment. And through FERPA, you can attach the documents to the child's ed record. So when you're working with the school psych, you have all this data. And it's not just the standardized test scores. You, mom, are like, here's the outside therapist, here's their progress notes. Did an outside eval, here's their stuff. So you're using all this other stuff, and you are learning how to document your child's needs and know how to ask for things. So hopefully when you do come to the IEP table, you've been able to say, here's what I wanted my child testing in, here's what I'm concerned with. And maybe the child either qualified or didn't qualify, but at least the assessor was looking at all the suspected areas of need instead of just, I test all my learning disabled child the same way. And same thing when you come to the IEP, if you're like, yeah, I don't agree with this, then you understand the process. Well, I noticed that school psych, you didn't address the assessment in that. So I would like to have supplemental testing. So you don't have to go through an IE, you don't have to go through all that drama. And you can get another psychologist from the same school district to test in another area. So it's a simple way, instead of wasting all these thousands of dollars of getting a private report and doing a reeval, which you totally can ask for because they omitted some information or didn't include your concerns in the original assessment report.
Interesting. Okay, that's great. And so since you are in California, does your program work for people all over the country, or is it just for California?
It does work for people all over the country, Jess. That's a great question because I get that a lot. And the thing that I tell people right up front is I say I'm based on all the federal laws. So the first thing you do before you do anything else is you need to look up your state requirements and your local requirements. Because even though I worked in Los Angeles my entire time, every district had their own policy. Every district had their own little, nuances, and they all had their different ways of doing things. So if you understand in your area what you need to ask for, then when you write your request letter, you already know the eligibility criteria for a learning disability if you're in Louisiana. And then when you write your letter to request testing, you're writing the letter based on the ed code because you know what to ask for. And then you know what to test for because you already know the rules. So it actually helps that I practice nationally because then it gets everyone to kind of look at okay, what is the requirements here? What are the timelines? All of that, instead of doing what we normally do, which is my child needs testing. And then you come to the meeting and you're like, what? This is not what I asked for. They didn't qualify. Like what happened?
And how difficult is it to read the state requirements?
It's not that tricky when you get to the state website. It really depends. Some states do a better job than others. California is a little tricky to navigate their website, but other states I've been to, Maryland, Pennsylvania, whatever, I look at their website and it's right then and there. So Google is your friend. And when you type in, eligibility code for X state, or you type in, even better yet, if you know the school district that you're in, usually online, they have the parent procedural safeguards, and those are golden because those will say eligibility timelines, or not, they'll say timelines for assessment. Sometimes they'll say eligibility. They'll have referrals, they'll have all of that. So in those procedural safeguards, you don't wait until the IEP to look at them. You look at them before you even request for testing, because then oh, here is the policy. Here is who I send the letter to. Here's what has to happen, or I have to get a NORUP, or I have to get a prior written notice. You learn all this stuff before. So, and I walk families through the process, but if once you learn that yourself, then you're not having to go out and spend thousands of dollars on something where you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I could have looked that up.
And this is kind of on a different note, but like in California, can you request that they do a phonological component for the testing in the school district so that parents don't have to go outside of the school and pay for a psychologist to do a neuro test?
That is a great question, Jess. And the answer is yes. So the way it works in California, and I can speak to this because this is my home state, is that they don't test for dyslexia per se. I'm putting that in quotes. But what they do is that anytime you request for a special education assessment in California, they have to look at all the areas of need. And that's why I keep talking about the areas of need. So if you talk to the assessor and you say, I want a TAPS, or I want what's called the CTOP, the assessor in the district will say, well, I don't have to do that. I can do what's based on our battery. But if you change the way you ask for things and say, I think my child has dyslexia, they struggle in phonological awareness, can you give an assessment that looks at phonological awareness? Then they have to do it. And that's why when you write those parent letters of attachment, parent reports, you say, I want testing in these areas of need. So the assessor has to include the parent input. They have to include the areas of need. And then because you wrote that awesome request letter, they have to test there. Otherwise, if you go in and you say, I want a special ed assessment, and I think my child is dyslexic, they could give this test, they could give that test, and then they didn't address the areas of need. So you're learning how to ask for things and how to document just like an advocate. So when you get the report, that they test in those areas that you asked for.
So that just saved thousands of dollars for parents to be able to put towards their children receiving our tutoring services.
Yes.
Because they're no longer having to pay for an advocate. They're no longer having to pay $2,500 to $3,500 for an outside evaluation that may not even be accepted by the school district.
Yes. And that's one big thing that I saw all the time as a school psych, Jess, is that parents would spend 7, 10, 15,000 in LA to go get a private eval. And they were like, oh my gosh, answers. This is awesome. They come to the IEP and the team was like, cool. Thanks so much for the report. We're on our way. And it was like, wait, aren't you just going to put that in the IEP? And it doesn't work that way. Is that when you submit an outside report, the school has to review and consider the information. What they're supposed to do is they're supposed to document it in the IEP. Here's the outside eval, here's a summary of findings. And then the school district, like the school psych or someone else, has to decide, okay, we're going to test in this area or we're not. But a lot of times they don't. They're just like, thank you so much for the report. And the parents don't realize it doesn't automatically transfer to the IEP. If you get a school assessment that's rock hard and amazing, then to get that written into the IEP is a lot easier. The key is you have to get a great assessment. And that's where that collaboration, working with the assessors and knowing what to ask for and how to get it is a game changer, instead of trying to do all this outside stuff, which is totally well-meaning, but then you're like, why can't they just write it on the IEP?
So now I understand how when my youngest son was 16, I was able to have a test done for vision therapy, because people said that never happens. You can never get the school district to pay for vision therapy. But I must have worded it correctly without even realizing what I was doing, where and I went through lots of steps, and it was at the end of his educational career. However, we did get 1.5 years of vision therapy paid for by the school, because I must have worded it correctly.
Yeah. And it's frustrating because so many parents, they go and find an advocate or an attorney, and there's definitely times that you need it. I'm not saying there isn't. But for the most part, when you feel like that the assessment isn't comprehensive, or you feel like there's a lapse in services, you can resolve the issues yourself. And then when you go out and hire an attorney, it's like, then they do a settlement offer, then they do a mediation agreement, and then you still have to come back to the IEP table. And then you sever the relationship with the school. It's like a divorce. And then the whole rest of the years, it's like the school district doesn't trust you. And it's so heartbreaking, and it's so expensive. So there's a better way to resolve things and work with a team without pulling out your hair, for every IEP meeting.
Well, and we have a student who the parents probably hired an advocate. They got paid for only 1 year of funding to help their son outside of the school. So for 1 year, we were tutoring him in reading, spelling, writing, and math, because she had the funds, and she had to use those funds up in that 1 year. So now he's run out of funds from the school, and mom's paying out of pocket. So he's only working on one subject at a time. But that must have been how the advocate had it written, which wasn't necessarily to his advantage.
Yeah, that's how settlement agreements work, is that they compensate for the areas, but then again, you still have to go back to the IEP. So the most important thing out of this, I guess I could say, Jess, is that when you put things in the IEP, then that's more powerful. When you do all these outside things, if it's not in the document itself, it's not going to get resolved. So in the case that you're discussing, is that the parent was doing all the supplemental stuff outside. And if it could have gotten written on the IEP in terms of, here's my child's areas of need, I have to do all this because my child can't access the curriculum, and here's my parent report, here's the tutoring agency report. Okay, team, can you add these supports in there? Or done a reeval, right? Because it sounded like there was some information that was missing, and so they needed a reevaluation. Then it could have gotten resolved quicker. And I'm not saying that there's a right way or a wrong way. There's always different ways. And in maybe that child's case, it was the best. But I feel like when parents are better educated and they have choices, then they can be the ones that are like, oh, this is the avenue I want to take, instead of going down one avenue. And they're like, oh, I wish I would have known the process. Like I could have saved, made a better choice.
So my question is there a possibility for the mom to be able to go back and get funding again if she words it in a way that the school will be accepting of that, because he's nonverbal, he has apraxia, and the school is not meeting his needs? Or once they settle, is that the end of that?
You have to look at the settlement agreement, and usually the problem with a lot of settlement agreements is that there's a stipulation in there that you kind of forego a lot of your parental rights and safeguards. So meaning you can't go back after, and that's the downfall of a lot of those settlement agreements. Plus they're private, and so everyone else can't see it. Like I was a school psych, and we would have to do an assessment every year for a child, and I'm like, well, can I look at the other reports? And they're like, no, you
Oh,
just
wow.
and I was like, wait, what? So it's settlement agreements are these funny things. I think the bottom line to answer your question, Jess, is that if a child is struggling and something is not going right, the best thing you can do is, okay, what are we missing here? And so if the child is struggling or they're not succeeding and there's new information or they're not thriving, then doing a comprehensive assessment through the school district is going to be better, because then you're going to have the information in terms of what services and supports to offer. So many times when I was a school psychologist, we would have a meeting and the child would be failing. And we're like, okay, well, let's put them in more resource, or let's do that. And we wouldn't be redoing the testing. And so we would be crafting goals based on what we thought. We would be changing the accommodations, but we didn't have the data to back it. And then the child wouldn't be doing well continuing on. And so we didn't start from a great foundation. And so that's why I talk about getting a good comprehensive assessment. So if there's something new, if your child is struggling, they're not succeeding, getting a reevaluation or supplemental testing is the best thing you can do, because then you have the data to look at, okay, here's what's really happening here. And then when you come back to the team, then when you build a plan, you're going to say, here's what we're going to do differently, instead of guessing, not sure, I don't know. And then you kind of piecemeal it out without actually having the data to use that, to rewrite the plan.
How often do you see that when they have the IEP written well, that families or students actually get the services that they need?
It seems like it's pretty easy. It just depends. Some school districts that I've worked with are kind of like, they just kind of, this is what we offer, the standard fare and special education for everyone. And so they're not as familiar with the special ed law. And so then they do everything the same. And I think what I work on with my training is broadening that mindset and really focusing on the individual. And when you work with the families and with the child, you save money in terms of having to file due process, doing all that. But ultimately, the kids win. And it's just like anything else, is special education is really a service industry. And we don't think of it that way. We don't think of it like you have to have a good meeting. And when parents are happy, schools are happy. And that's why we need to redo the whole process by having more productive meetings, is that when the parents are happy, that means their kids are thriving and doing better. And when the kids are thriving, they don't need maybe as much services or supports, and they do better, instead of everything we do for every child is the same way. And so we're going to approach this district from the same way for every child. And then if they don't like it, they can file for due process. That way it never succeeds. It frustrates everybody. It creates a haphazard plan. And then ultimately the kids don't do well. So it's kind of revamping how we have the meetings, but ultimately, how do we work together as a team? How can we work better so that parents aren't demanding things at IEPs, and that schools are like, oh, I didn't know I can write the IEP that way. That's kind of cool. I think I'm going to try that.
Well, that is so much amazing information that you have provided. Is there anything else that you feel that would be of value to our listeners to learn about from you?
I think when we think about special education, when your child, so if your child, let's say, it's no matter if they're in high school or preschool, we have to do what's called like a vision plan. And so IEPs are typically 1 year to run 1 year, but we moms, we dads, we grandmas, we are always looking at the long-term picture. So when you have that first IEP, or when you have an annual IEP, don't think about this goal needs to be right, or this needs to be that. You need to think about the big picture. And so if you start with creating what's called a vision plan, where you're mapping it out and you're like, okay, 3 years from now, I would like my child to not have the aid anymore. Then you're going to start pulling back to determine, what are we going to do for this year's IEP to go to next year's IEP? Because as parents, we're going to sit on that IEP team year after year. The resource teacher probably won't be their resource teacher next year. So they're going to be starting from ground zero. But you as mom, you as grandma, you as dad, you have that power to be an amazing advocate. So if you map out that vision plan, and I tell always parents, put it up on the fridge, Then you can say, okay, 5 years from now, I want my child to be in college prep classes. Then you map out each IEP. And when you come to the IEP meeting with the vision plan, you're like, here's what I think April can do in 5 years. So yeah, that's a 5-year plan, but we're going to craft goals because we're going to work on the first part of that vision plan. And so you need to think about long-term IEPs, not just annual, not just year to year, not just do they make the goal, but what do you really want for your child? And then pull back. And so each year you're kind of moving it and crafting it, and you can change it. I changed my vision plan for my kids all the time. And it made it so much easier because then you're not focusing on like the micro stuff, you're focusing on the macro, which is really what we're talking about here. Everybody knows after high school and even college, they have disability supports, but nobody has an IEP. So we really need to think about what are we going to do each year from year to craft the big picture of what we want, which is our children to be independent and for our children to be happy.
I love that. So basically you're saying the parents should be in the driver's seat, which all the IEP meetings I have been to, the special ed person has been in the driver's seat and I have been in the passenger seat. And sometimes I was a backseat driver,
Absolutely.
but I was never in the driver's seat.
Yes. And that's the difference is that when you craft an IEP, including the parents and even schools, when you're like, I want you parent to be a part of this meeting, it's not threatening. It's not scary because that's the way we're trained. I was trained as a school psychologist, like, do this and do that and don't get the parent agitated, when actually I should have been trained, work with the parent, see what the parent wants. Parent has so much information. And so when you're empowered as a parent, and then you go into these IEPs with this flexible mindset, like I'm not going to focus on speech, I'm going to focus on my child and what they need, and I'll get the speech, but the way I ask for it is a different way. It just makes the whole dynamic for the meetings easier, less stressful. You don't have to go out and drink a glass of wine afterwards. And ultimately, your kids are going to come into the IEP because they come and we watch you as a mom, and they're not going to see you losing your cookies because you're going to feel much more comfortable at the meeting. And your kid's going to be like, oh, it's kind of cool. Like, I like having an IEP. My mom seems happy about it. And the schools are like happy that I have, services. And it's this whole different way of doing meetings instead of drama, frustration. And then kids see the parents just being so frustrated because it can be.
That's so interesting. So in LA, our kids at the IEP meetings?
So in California, the way that the law works is once you're age 14, you have a right to come to the meeting. But when I was a school psychologist and I worked in elementary schools, I would encourage the kids to come to the meetings. And a lot of people are like, why are they coming? And I said, because it's their program. Like, they can say what they want. And it doesn't matter if the child has an intellectual disability or can't verbal. Everybody has a right to understand what they're doing. And when the kids come to the meeting and they're part of it, they're like, yeah, this accommodation really works for me, or I like going to speech, or that's not helping me. When they are of age in the state, then they're already running their meetings. They understand the accommodations. They can go back to the teacher and say, actually, these are the accommodations that I have. Can you work on this? Because here's my accommodation sheet and I carry it in my folder every day. Wow. Instead of like, I don't know what's happening. And then you get to college and they're like, I don't know how to advocate myself because they hadn't been trained. Yeah. So it's making things feel more comfortable and they're more part of the meeting. Why is it that every SST or every parent-teacher conference, we don't include students?
Well, and I think one of the things, like you're talking about a positive environment. I was just talking to a mom recently and she was like, I don't understand why in some states they want the kids at the IEP meetings and these poor kids are hearing all the things that they can't do. Yeah. And in that kind of situation, you don't want your kids there because you don't want them to feel worse about themselves. But what you're talking about is empowered parents getting what their kids need and not focusing on their weaknesses so that it is a positive environment. Because both of my kids who had IEPs started attending their IEP meetings in high school. And so by the time they were done with high school, they weren't that empowered because they had only been to 4 meetings or maybe even just 3 meetings. And so it wasn't as beneficial for them. However, my youngest son's IEP meetings in high school were helpful because he did charter. And so it was a homeschool charter situation, which is not as common at this point, just 5 years later. However, they wanted him to take online classes, and he was like, I don't do well online. And so we were able to negotiate. He was willing to give it a try now that he was older, and they were willing to only have him do certain classes online, and some of his classes, the tutor or the speech therapist would come to our house, or the physical therapist would come to our house. So he was able to negotiate like you're talking about because he was there. And had he started in being at meetings in pre-K when he started getting speech therapy through the public school system, then he would have been more prepared and able to stand up for his wants and his needs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, April, this is so exciting. I really hope that a lot of the listeners will take advantage of the program that you have created, because it sounds amazing. It sounds life-changing for families who do take advantage of it. Because like I said, I just started getting things for my youngest son at the end of my parenting career. And it would have been amazing had I been able to get that for my daughter or my child who didn't qualify for an IEP. I wish I had this opportunity when they were kids. Thank you so much for providing this to our parents these days.
You're so welcome. I'm so excited to offer this. And I do think it's life-changing. And then you don't have to go and find an advocate. And ultimately, you can have a better experience at the meeting and they're not stressful. You can actually look forward to IEPs, which a lot of people laugh, but it's true. If you look forward to your meeting, imagine like feeling like, oh, I'm going to go shopping or I'm going to have an IEP meeting, and you have that same kind of positive feeling. That is so different.
Yeah. I remember I had an IEP meeting and I was at Disneyland, and it brought me down, So yeah, that'd be great to be able to be at Disneyland for an IEP meeting. It was like a follow-up meeting, but to have been at Disneyland and been able to continue in my high spirits at the happiest place on earth. So what's the best way for people to get in touch with you and purchase your program?
So my main website is riseeducationaladvocacy.com. You can also connect with me on socials, Rise Ed Advocacy. I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Pinterest. And if you connect with me through social media, you'll find my link in bio, and all my trainings are there. But I would love to be able to connect with you so you can get simple tips and strategies, and also check out my coursework, because like I said, it's a different way. And my approach is very different from a typical advocate, but I try to use all the hats that I've worn over the years, Jess, to kind of have a well-rounded approach to IEP training instead of, the typical way, because the typical way isn't working and kids aren't thriving. And post-pandemic, we need to change things, and we need to change it big. And the only way we're going to do it is by working with everybody on the team.
Well, and I think like you hit the nail on the head saying that you have a vast understanding of the IEP process as a parent, as a teacher, as a, what was the other thing?
School psych. And then I have a licensed educational psychologist degree too.
There you go. Yes. It's kind of like me being well-rounded with dyslexia. I understand better than someone who just has taught people with dyslexia. So same thing. You're very well-rounded.
Yeah. And that's the different things. It's just like when you parent a baby and then you have your second or third child, or you're done with your last one, you're off at college, you think about, man, when they were 2, I could have done things so much better. But you don't have that foresight until you've lived it and you've walked it. And that's why people, by the 3rd or 4th kid, you're like, yeah, I've got this. So sometimes it takes a few years. But my goal is to make it so that parents don't have to wait those first few years, that they can get it right away and that you can feel so much better at the table.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again, April. I appreciate you coming on the show with us.
You're so welcome.